Welcome back, everyone. Today, we dive into one of the most significant battles in history, a turning point in the ancient world and World War II. We're talking about the Battle of Midway, the monumental naval clash that followed the attack on Pearl Harbor and escalated the war in the Pacific. 6 months after the epic attack on Moke Harbor in the Pacific Ocean, the United States Naval War Group faces a new threat. A giant monster has emerged. Amid the chaos, Kido, a fearless samurai warrior who's never faced defeat, seizes the moment. Against all odds, he triumphs over an adversary that had dominated much of Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. The plan, codenamed AF, unleashed a series of shocking and sudden airstrikes. The Japanese Empire had rapidly achieved its initial strategic objectives, almost completely controlling the western part of the vast Pacific Ocean. They held key territories like the Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, and especially the Dutch East Indies, a resource-rich region, particularly valuable for its oil reserves. But even with these gains, it wasn't enough to satisfy the ambitions of the Kido Butai fleet. Everything changed on October 18, 1942, when the United States launched a daring counterattack with 16 B-52 bombers, targeting Tokyo itself. Seeing their capital under siege shook Japan to its core. The military and government needed to restore faith among their people and prevent further bombings. They knew they had to knock the Americans out of the Pacific, once and for all. Enter Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant architect behind Japan's strategy. His sights were set on Midway Island, the perfect target to deliver a crushing blow to the United States. Midway, as the name suggests, sits halfway between the U.S. and Japan, 5,200 kilometers from San Francisco and 4,100 kilometers from Tokyo, just off the northwest tip of the Hawaiian archipelago. This small 6.2 kilometers coral island was a vital military outpost during World War II, serving as a critical refueling station for trans-Pacific operations and a key defense point for the U.S. West Coast. Yamamoto believed that an attack on Midway would force the U.S. to defend its territory, drawing the entire Pacific Fleet into an ambush where they could be decisively destroyed. His ultimate goal? Forcing the U.S. to the negotiating table and allowing Japan to establish dominance over the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Yamamoto's plan was incredibly complex and required precise coordination between multiple fleets spread across hundreds of miles of open sea. The attack was planned in 3 major phases. First, an airstrike on Midway. Second, a ground invasion force of 5,000 soldiers to eliminate any remaining American defenses. And third, an ambush of American reinforcements from Pearl Harbor, aiming to decimate the U.S. Pacific Fleet. It was a perfect plan, except for one thing. The U.S. had already cracked Japan's code. 3 months prior, U.S. naval intelligence at Pearl Harbor intercepted Japanese communications under the codename AF. By April 1942, a team of cryptographers led by Navy Major Joseph Rochefort had decrypted the Japanese Navy's JN-25B cipher, a complex code that mixed ancient 10th century Japanese poetry with modern dialects. This breakthrough allowed the U.S. to anticipate Japan's next moves. Among the intercepted communications was a message signed by none other than Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself, outlining the entire plan for the Battle of Midway. A huge force arrived at a location referred to as AF. By combining different data points, experts concluded that AF was most likely Midway Island. To confirm their suspicions, the U.S. Navy sent out a simple encrypted message from the Midway base reporting a freshwater shortage due to a water plant malfunction. Shortly after, the Japanese sent a coded message through JN-25 stating that AF was having issues with fresh water. There was no longer any doubt. AF was indeed Midway. Breaking the code, however, was just the first step. Victory wasn't guaranteed, but it gave the U.S. Navy a crucial advantage on the battlefield. All 3 available American aircraft carriers, including the heavily damaged USS Yorktown, fresh from the Battle of the Coral Sea, were dispatched to Midway. The stage was set, and a steel defense line was erected in anticipation of the Japanese assault. Let's take a look at the forces involved in this historic showdown. On the Japanese side, all 4 major aircraft carriers were deployed: Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, and Hiryu. Accompanying them were 248 aircraft of various types, 16 seaplanes, 13 destroyers, and 2 battleships, all under the command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the mastermind behind the Pearl Harbor attack. The main strike force of the Japanese Navy consisted of the HE D-3A1 dive bomber and the Nakajima B-5N2 torpedo bomber, backed by the fast and highly maneuverable Mitsubishi A-6M0. Japanese pilots were, at the time, better trained and more experienced in combat than their American counterparts. On the American side, the USS Enterprise, USS Yorktown, and USS Hornet led the charge with 233 aircraft, 15 destroyers, 8 cruisers, and 16 submarines. Additionally, 127 aircraft were stationed at Midway itself. The overall commander of the battle was Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, leading the 9th Pacific Fleet. On the morning of June 3rd, Jack Reed, a U.S. Navy pilot flying a PBY Catalina reconnaissance plane, spotted the first Japanese ships 800 kilometers west of Midway. Though he believed he had located the main fleet, it was only the second Japanese attack force. Immediately, 9 B-17 bombers were dispatched to strike, though they failed to land any hits. This skirmish marked the beginning of what would become one of the most devastating naval battles in history. By the morning of June 4th, at a distance of just 386 kilometers from Midway, Vice Admiral Nagumo ordered the launch of 108 aircraft from all 4 carriers. At the same time, 7 reconnaissance planes were dispatched from the heavy cruisers Chikuma and the battleship Haruna. However, a crucial error occurred when the 8th reconnaissance plane took off more than 30 minutes late, leaving a critical gap in Japanese coverage. At 5:50 a.m., air raid sirens blared across Midway. U.S. aircraft were quickly scrambled into the skies. 6 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers and 4 B-26 Marauders flew north toward the Japanese fleet, while 26 Marine Corps fighters, including Brewster F-2A Buffaloes and Grumman F-4F Wildcats, took off to intercept the incoming Japanese planes. The outdated Buffalo fighters were no match for the superior A-6M0s. 15 American planes were shot down, 7 were damaged, and only 2 returned to base. Meanwhile, the Japanese lost just 4 aircraft as they pressed on toward Midway. By 6:20 a.m., Kido Butai's planes reached Midway, unleashing a devastating assault. U.S. barracks and military bases were set ablaze, and rows of parked planes were destroyed in the firestorm. Despite being overwhelmed, U.S. anti-aircraft defenses shot down 11 Japanese planes, while 43 others sustained varying degrees of damage. Japanese pilots reported back to Admiral Nagumo that a second strike would be necessary to neutralize Midway's defenses. While this was happening, American long-range bombers launched their first wave of attacks on the Japanese fleet. At 7:10 a.m., 6 TBF Avengers and 4 B-26 Marauders closed in on the Japanese carriers Akagi and Hiri. 30 Zeros, patrolling the skies, immediately engaged the U.S. bombers. In a fierce battle, 5 Avengers and 2 Marauders were shot down by the Zeros, while the remaining bombers launched torpedoes at the Akagi. Thanks to its incredible maneuverability, the Akagi narrowly avoided the torpedoes, with 1 B-26 crashing into the sea after attempting a suicide dive toward the carrier. Admiral Nagumo, who had barely escaped, was thrown into a precarious situation. He had reserved half of his aircraft, 2 squadrons, one of dive bombers and the other of torpedo bombers, for an attack on any American ships that were detected. However, after receiving reports that Midway's defenses still needed to be neutralized, Nagumo ordered the reserve aircraft to be rearmed with bombs for a second land strike. At 7:40 a.m., as the Japanese planes were being rearmed, a reconnaissance plane sent back a report of a large American naval force approaching from the east, including aircraft carriers. This was the first time Nagumo was caught off guard. He had an opportunity to launch an immediate strike, but it had to be done quickly, as the Midway attack group would soon return, running low on fuel and in need of landing space. Some aircraft were already damaged and had to be dealt with urgently. Arranging sorties for the planes would take at least 30 to 45 minutes, since if they launched immediately, some aircraft would be forced into battle without proper weapons. After much hesitation, the Japanese commanders decided to land the initial attack force and launch the reserve afterward, a decision that would be costly. During this critical window, the Americans relentlessly launched attacks. At 7 a.m., a wave of fighter planes took off from the USS Hornet and USS Enterprise, and less than an hour later, aircraft from the USS Yorktown also received orders to launch. At 7:47 a.m., before the Hornet and Enterprise planes could engage, 16 U.S. Marine Corps SBD Dauntless dive bombers appeared, launching a second attack on the Japanese carrier Hiryu. However, due to a lack of combat experience, all their bombs missed the mark. 8 Dauntless dive bombers were shot down by Japanese Zeros, while the rest limped back to base. The first wave of the U.S. Navy's attack had been repelled, but just as one squadron was pushed back, another would storm forward, unrelenting. At 8:09 a.m., 12 B-17 Flying Fortresses took off from Midway and attempted to bomb the Japanese fleet, though with little success. At 8:30 a.m., 11 SBD dive bombers launched yet another airstrike, this time targeting the Haruna-class battleships nearby. Though the American air attacks inflicted no significant damage, they created confusion and disarray within Nagumo's fleet. By 9:10 a.m., the Japanese attack force returning from Midway began landing back on their carriers, refueling and rearming for their next mission against the American fleet. Meanwhile, aircraft from the Hornet and Enterprise were en route, preparing for their own assault. At 9:20 a.m., Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, consisting of 15 TB Devastator torpedo bombers, led the American attack on the Japanese fleet. In response, 21 Japanese Zeros swiftly intercepted them. The result was devastating. VT-8 was decimated, with 29 of the 30 pilots either killed or shot down in the battle. Shortly after, at 9:40 a.m., another squadron of 14 Devastators from Torpedo Squadron 6, VT-6, engaged the Japanese Zeros. 10 of the 14 bombers were shot down, and although 9 torpedoes were launched, none hit their intended targets. The Japanese anti-aircraft defenses remained tight and impenetrable, but the Americans did not back down. At 10 a.m., Torpedo Squadron 3, VT-3, consisting of 12 torpedo bombers from the USS Yorktown, launched another attack, drawing Japanese fighter interceptors to the south. Though they failed to hit the target, their efforts were not in vain. The continuous assaults had stretched the Japanese defensive forces thin, pulling them away from critical positions. At this point, the Japanese still held the upper hand. The American torpedo bombers had failed to inflict any serious damage, and it seemed like the tide of the battle favored the Empire of Japan. If the situation continued, the Americans risked losing not only Midway, but potentially Hawaii itself. But then, fate took a sharp turn. Nagumo's excessive caution had cost the Japanese Navy precious time, and by now, the Americans had achieved 2 crucial outcomes. First, they had kept the Japanese fleet in a high state of defense, preventing effective reconnaissance. Second, the attacks from VT-8, VT-6, and VT-3 had drawn the Japanese fighters out of position. The pivotal moment came at 10:20 a.m. With the Japanese Zero fighters occupied by the torpedo bombers, 2 American dive bomber squadrons, one from the northeast, the other from the southwest, approached the Japanese fleet. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. All 4 Japanese carriers had their decks filled with planes, loaded with bombs and fuel, and were preparing for their next strike. It was the moment when a carrier was at its most vulnerable. At 10:25 a.m., 31 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the USS Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, descended on the Japanese fleet. They unleashed a devastating attack on the carriers Kaga and Akagi. The Kaga, with its planes loaded and ready for battle, was hit by several bombs, including one 450-kilogram bomb, which tore the carrier apart. Seeing the Kaga in flames, 3 American planes broke off and dove toward the Akagi. At 10:26 a.m., a 450-kilogram bomb struck the Akagi, the flagship of the Japanese carrier fleet, igniting a fire that raged out of control. The Japanese Navy's greatest aircraft carrier was now engulfed in flames, but the attack wasn't over. Immediately following this, a squadron of 17 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the USS Yorktown, commanded by Max Leslie, swooped down on the remaining 2 carriers, Hiryu and Soryu. 3 bombs struck the Soryu, which was loaded with weapons and fuel. Explosions ripped through the carrier, engulfing it in flames. The Hiryu fared slightly better, but it too sustained serious damage. By 10:26 a.m., 3 of Japan's 4 aircraft carriers had been eliminated from combat. The Battle of Midway had taken a dramatic turn, and the tide of the war in the Pacific had shifted. American planes were ordered to return to base, but Japan wasn't done yet. Sensing a fleeting opportunity, the Japanese launched a desperate counterattack. A total of 24 planes immediately took off in pursuit of the American fleet. Their first target, the USS Yorktown. 3 bombs hit Yorktown, causing massive damage. The ship's air squadrons, 13 dive bombers and 3 fighters, were obliterated. Despite the damage, Yorktown's crew worked feverishly to repair the carrier, but Japan wasn't finished. More than an hour later, a second attack came, this time featuring a squadron of Zeros and 10 Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers. They once again targeted Yorktown, mistaking it for a fresh American carrier due to its remarkable speed of recovery. 2 torpedoes struck the already damaged Yorktown, crippling it. The ship was barely hanging on, yet the Japanese mistakenly believed they had destroyed 2 separate American carriers, boosting their morale. Though only 41 aircraft remained aboard the Japanese carrier Hiryu, Admiral Yamaguchi was convinced they still had enough firepower to take on the Americans. However, Vice Admiral Nagumo disagreed. With his fleet battered and depleted, he ordered the entire force to retreat west, abandoning any hopes of a third strike. By late afternoon, it was America's turn for payback. A reconnaissance plane from Yorktown discovered the position of the Japanese carrier Hiryu. In response, 42 dive bombers from the USS Enterprise and USS Hornet took off in unison, ready for one last thunderous assault. Hiryu, though guarded by 13 formidable Zero fighters, was hit hard. 4 bombs found their mark, tearing through the carrier's decks, igniting massive fires, and dooming the last operational Japanese aircraft carrier. In a moment of honor and tragedy, Rear Admiral Yamaguchi and Captain Tomeo Kaku chose to go down with their ship. With Hiryu burning and sinking, the balance of power in the Pacific shifted dramatically. Admiral Yamamoto had no choice but to abandon his plan to invade Midway. The Japanese fleet was in full retreat, pursued relentlessly by the U.S. Navy. 1 Japanese cruiser was sunk, and several other warships suffered damage in the days that followed. In a final grim note, the USS Yorktown was hit by another torpedo during the pursuit, finally succumbing to the damage and sinking. The Battle of Midway came to a close, but its outcome would echo through history. The Japanese Navy suffered immense losses: 3,057 men, 4 aircraft carriers, 1 cruiser, and 248 planes. The U.S. Navy, by comparison, lost 362 men, 1 aircraft carrier Yorktown, 1 destroyer, and 144 planes. The defeat crippled Japan's offensive in the Pacific, shattering their plans to seize New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa. This battle marked a turning point in World War II. The once dominant Japanese Navy was now on the defensive, and the balance of naval power in the Pacific had shifted. The lack of early warning radar on Japanese warships, combined with Nagumo's hesitant decision-making, were cited as the key factors in their defeat. If Pearl Harbor had been Japan's opening salvo that established their early dominance, Midway was the decisive counterblow. It was the battle where the United States halted Japan's relentless advance and began its path to ultimate victory in the Pacific theater. The tides had turned. With this, the epic Battle of Midway draws to a close, a pivotal moment in history that forever altered the course of World War II. Let me know if you'd like any further adjustments or more historical stories like this. Thank you very much.